Thanks for being with us today on East Idaho Newsmakers. I'm Nate Eaton. We are talking with Brian Wood today. He is the owner of Wood Funeral Home and a funeral director who directs funerals. And I guess that will be my first question, Brian. What does a funeral director do?
You know, in Idaho, they do different things than you would if you lived in Arizona or other states. Some states allow you to be strictly a mortician, which is someone that deals directly with the deceased individual. So prep work, embalming, cosmetics, all of that. That's a mortician duty. A funeral director works with the families, and those are the ones that you see when you come into a funeral home. So they're dressed like me, they're handing out the programs, they're showing people in. Well, we make the arrangements with the families when they come in. We sit down with them and kind of go through their plan and kind of what their needs are. But here in Idaho, to have a license, you're required to be both a funeral director and a mortician. It's a single license here, whereas in many states they're separate.
So meaning you can handle the body of the deceased and then also prepare them for the funeral and also go to the funeral and hand out programs and from basically start to finish.
Yep, and we do that at our firm.
How did you get involved with this business?
So I grew up with a dad that was in it. In fact, it's a multi-generational business. My great-great-grandfather was a funeral director. And so I'm the 5th generation funeral director in my family.
Oh, wow.
So growing up with it, you know, you always kind of look up to your dad and you want to be like him. He didn't really push the business on any of us kids just because he knew it was more of a calling. It was something you had to want to do. And so it wasn't until later in my life that I really wanted to do it. When I was in college, I wanted to come and work with my dad and kind of just see what it was like, and I immediately knew that it was something I wanted to do.
And you guys have, Wood Funeral has 2 locations, Idaho Falls and Ammon, along with the crematorium. Is that a separate building?
Yeah, so our downtown Idaho Falls office has a crematorium that's in our existing funeral home, and our Ammon location has its own crematorium in its own separate building on the property. So both have a crematorium, but one's a separate building out in Ammon.
So was your great-great-grandfather one of the first funeral directors in East Idaho?
Actually, my great-great-grandfather was operating out of Murray, Utah.
Oh, okay.
And my great-grandpa Wood met and married his daughter, and therefore was introduced into the funeral business, and quickly realized this is something he would want to do for his family, and came to Idaho, and he purchased an older funeral home that was just right downtown Idaho Falls. In fact, it was on the corner of Broadway and Yellowstone. There's like an old building that you can buy some used cars out of every now and again, but it used to be a funeral home called Dinwoody Funeral Home, and it was started in 1911, and my great-grandpa bought it in 1925. From that guy. Operated it there for a few years and then moved it a few blocks over to our North Ridge, which we've been there ever since.
Oh my gosh. And is it one of those things growing up that you're kind of surrounded by it? Because a lot of people would be like, oh, I don't know if I want to go into that, death and things like that. But because you were surrounded by it, you took an interest in it as well?
You know, as a kid, I was kind of like the rest of the guys. You know, my friends, I was kind of scared of it. The only thing I knew about death as a kid, I had learned from scary movies and Halloween cartoons. And so I was kind of nervous about it too. But I think what it really took is seeing the level of service and the fulfillment you receive from serving families. And when I was a young college student, that was my very first actual time I spent working there. And that's when I kind of was like, wow, this there's a lot more to this than just dealing with a deceased. You know, you get to serve somebody every single day. It helps you become a better father because you realize how fragile life can be and short. And so it was something that I needed in my life.
You have to deal with such a variety of families and circumstances, from the elderly to newborns to horrific crimes. How are you able to manage all that and not let it get to you?
You know, it took a few years to be able to just compartmentalize some of the things that you have at work. It took some getting used to. You know, I think my very first really tragic death was a young girl who was the same age as my oldest daughter at the time. And it took that funeral for me to be able to, first of all, I had to learn how to go home at the end of the day and be able to leave work at work. And so I think I had to learn to compartmentalize some of that. But it also helped me commit to a level of service for these families that you just absolutely have to give your all for every single family that comes through those doors. But going back to your question, I think naturally your brain just figures out how to help you cope with different difficult scenarios. And so I don't think I had any skills or I took any special classes, but I just think over time I kind of learned how to deal with that.
And on the same vein, not to get graphic, you probably see bodies that have been pretty traumatized through accident or suicide or whatnot. Is that something you also have to kind of compartmentalize? Or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yep, you're right. You have tragedy, you have accidents, you have different things, and you just have to go in there knowing, hey, I'm helping a family. Just put on your work cap, go to work. When you're done, you can get through it, and this family's going to be happier because of you doing that.
And is it one of those things where you may go to the family and say, you may need to have a closed casket, or is that something that each family gets to determine on their own?
That's a great question. They actually kind of rely on us to guide them, and which is a good thing. And so we give them our professional opinion. There's many times where even after an accident, they can look natural. People may not even know they had an accident. There's other times where there's a lot of trauma, and we recommend to those families, hey, it may be a better opportunity to let the public and the family remember them how they are, but we always give them the opportunity to decide. We never say, hey, you've got to do this. And in fact, say somebody receives some head trauma in an accident, we always want that family to still be able to come in contact with their loved one. So a lot of times we'll even cover up some of those injuries and even just let them come in and just hold their hand. If that's the only thing that they do, it gives them some closure that they wouldn't get in any other way.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm sure you, as you mentioned, you're there to serve them, and you're sensitive based on the situation. And walk me through the process of I die today.
Okay.
From picking up the body at a house to burial in the ground. How does that all work?
Okay, so great question. So at our funeral home, we have 10 licensed funeral directors. Each one of us, most of us rotate being on call day to day. Most of us will work every day, and then at 5 o'clock, one of us will be on call that night. The phones will be transferred to us. And so whenever that call comes in, whether it's during office hours or at 8 p.m. or 2 a.m., we answer that phone and we're ready to go. If it's at a hospital or a nursing home, we go on our own. And that's because there's staff there, and there's you don't have to worry about stairs and different things that can help you move the body over onto your cot or your gurney. Mm-hmm. When you go into someone's home, we always have 2 or 3 that go together, depending on if you're going upstairs or different things there. And so we always take more than one person when we go to somebody's home. So we come immediately. We come dressed just like this. Doesn't matter what time of day or night it is. We want the family to know, hey, we're going to take care of you at a certain level of professionalism from the get-go. And usually right after the time of death, family's still in a little bit of shock. Even if their mom or grandma is 95 years old, it's still hard to have somebody be gone that's been in their life for so long. And so we try not to burden them too much when we're there at the call. We just say a few things. Which location would you like us to use? What time would work for you to come in tomorrow or the next day? And what are your wishes? And that's pretty much all we do on that first call. We don't want to just burden them with too much. Mm-hmm. And so usually they'll come in the next day, 10 or 11 in the morning. We'll sit down in a room and just kind of walk through everything that they kind of have in mind, whether it's burial or cremation. There's a lot of different facets of each choice. And we kind of pick a funeral day, walk through, and they choose kind of what they want. If they're going to a cemetery, they choose if they want a police escort to the cemetery or if they would like to travel informally. Or they choose if they want to have us help with catering afterwards at our funeral home, or if they'd rather do it at a church or a friend's home or something like that. So we go through a large checklist. They will select an urn or a casket. We walk through what the cemetery requires. So there's a checklist that we do with them at the funeral home. And then we kind of follow throughout the week. They'll bring in things such as their funeral program or their video tribute photos, different things. We'll give them a checklist of deadlines and things like that. And then come funeral day, we're there. We show them in. We make sure they're comfortable. We let them know what to expect as far as the general public coming in. We make sure they have plenty of time as a family to spend privately with their loved one. And so we're there kind of conducting and officiating over those services. And so we go through the funeral services, proceed out to the cemetery if they're having a burial or if they're having a cremation, depending on what their plans are with the urn. We'll either go to a cemetery or they're planning to scatter the ashes or they're planning to keep that urn. We'll just kind of, figure out what they want to do. And then after we're done at the cemetery, that's kind of the last time we work with them as far as the funeral proceedings. Oftentimes they'll come in a day or two later and we'll kind of walk through how did everything go. Here's a packet of everything that was left over at the funeral. Couple things like that. So that's kind of a nutshell.
That's helpful because I think a lot of people, I haven't had much experience with death. I wouldn't know who to call. I haven't thought about a cemetery or a funeral home or whatnot. What about actually preserving the body? How long can you keep the body before you've got to either cremate it or bury it?
Okay. So if somebody is being buried, a full casket burial, and if they're planning on having a viewing, then that body is required to have an embalming process, which basically preserves and restores that body and also sterilizes it so that any general public that comes in, they're safe from any issues that person may have had.
And you as a mortician do the embalming.
That's right.
And
yeah.
what does that involve?
So, trying to keep this...
G-rated,
yeah.
PG-rated, yeah.
So basically a chemical is added to the body that eradicates any issues. The blood is removed. So the chemical actually replaces the blood in the body, and that is what sterilizes and disinfects any issues, and it preserves. And so really it's mainly just a removal of the blood and adding of a chemical. And it usually takes about 3 hours.
Oh, well. 3 hours. And then is that when you would go on and... So then once the body's been embalmed, how long can it be preserved?
It can be preserved for a long time.
Really?
In fact, I've had a few disinterments, not to get too far offhand, but I had a disinterment of somebody that had been buried longer than I've been alive.
No way.
And they were moving her to another state where their family had relocated. Mm-hmm. And so they had a new family plot, and that casket was completely destroyed. And so we had to put that person in a new casket, and that person still looked really good.
Really?
It's been,
from the embalmment years before?
30-something years ago. And so it really depends. After somebody's been embalmed at our funeral home, they're usually good to go. They don't need any refrigeration or anything like that. They're fine. I had a family that was stuck in Hawaii a few years ago. They had storms, and they had someone pass away here, and it took them a month to get here. And when they got here, that person looked just the same as they did when they died.
Wow.
So.
And so then you might apply the makeup and the clothing the night of the viewing, the day of the viewing.
That's exactly right. Yep. We wait to do that until the day of the funeral, just so it's fresh, and it doesn't dry out. And so, yeah, they're just cleaned and bathed and kind of in a hospital gown until that point.
Okay, so we were talking ahead of our airing about cremation. And give us the stats, because I was alarmed that how many people are doing cremation now.
So Idaho is right where the rest of the country is. The nation is about 50% cremation. It's higher in some places and lower kind of down in the south, but Idaho is 50%, just right where the rest of the country averages out at. And it's slowly been trickling up to there, through the last few years. I remember, I think when I started about 15 years ago, we were probably around 25%. Maybe even 20%. But each year we've seen, cremation slowly catching up with burial.
And why is that?
There's a number of factors. I wish I knew exactly in every scenario, just so we kind of had a better idea. But for one thing, cremation is generally known as something that's a little less expensive than burial. And the reason is when someone is buried, they have to be put in a casket. So a family has the casket expense. When a casket is purchased, that casket has to be placed in a vault at the cemetery. Those vaults are fairly expensive, and when you place a vault at the cemetery, you're purchasing a full plot. So those expenses add up pretty quick. Whereas on cremation, you can have a number of services. You can still have a nice urn and a vault, but you can also have a very inexpensive cremation, something that people refer to as a basic cremation, where pretty much the only service we handle is picking the individual up and handling the cremation, and then giving the family the urn, and they have a private service. And so the range is a little bit different on the cremation, whereas burial, it's a little bit more expensive because of some of those things that come into play. I think a lot of the people planning funerals today, tradition is less important than it used to be. I think a lot of people in the past kind of wanted to follow what their family were doing, and I think today people just kind of want to decide to do whatever they want to do, and also I think times past, a lot of religions didn't really embrace cremation as much as they do today. And even in our area, the LDS Church and the Catholic Church are more accepting of cremation than they ever have been in the past.
And you were saying, a point I hadn't thought of is that a lot of people might want to have their loved one cremated so they can take the ashes home and have it there in the front room. But you actually might bring up another point with these families, saying you might want to bury them.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of people don't even think that's an option. I think a lot of times when people come in, they think if they're being cremated, they're going to take the urn home and have it up on the mantle, or they're going to go scatter the ashes in that loved one's one of their favorite fishing holes or something. But I talk to these families years later often in the grocery store, and I say, how have you been doing? And, I'll get feedback then, and they'll say, you know what? I wish I would have done something other than this or that. And one thing I find out is when people bury their urn at a cemetery, it gives them a special place to memorialize their loved one. And so on a holiday, or even when they just need a quiet moment with their loved one, they can travel, they can make it a special occasion, travel to this place, have a headstone, sit at that place and just kind of reflect and sit there quietly. Whereas if it's in the living room at home, over time it just kind of becomes part of the furniture in the room, and so I get that feedback a lot. And so we as funeral directors, at least at Wood Funeral Home, would recommend to families to consider burial of their ashes.
Is there a time of year where you can't plan your business really, right, as a funeral director, but are there trends where, okay, it's getting cold, we're going to have more deaths, or it's summer, we're going to have less? Do you kind of look at things like that?
I feel like over the 15 years that I've been doing it, it just changes so often, it's really hard to track. I think more of our accidents are happening in summertime, which are, you'd think in Idaho with snowmobiling and different things, but I think there's a little bit more accidents during the summertime. But I think overall it just kind of slowly flows. I was mentioning to you earlier, a lot of people will kind of hold on through the cold, like December, because they'll want to spend some holiday time with their family, so they'll hold on through Christmas, and then late in January and February, when it's kind of dark out, your family's gone, the credit card statement showed up from Christmas. There's a lot of depressing things about that time of year, and I think you'll see a few more older deaths at that time of year. So.
Ever had anybody wake up in the funeral home?
Not yet.
Okay.
Although we did have somebody come in once who was struggling with Alzheimer's, who thought they were dead, and they asked to pick out their casket.
Oh my! Well, if you ever have someone wake up, please call us.
Okay,
that's a story.
We'll have you run down there.
Yeah, that might go national. We started putting up obituaries on East Idaho News a year or two ago, and it is consistently underneath our homepage, consistently the most viewed section of our website. It just took off. Why do you think that is?
I think that's important to a lot of people to know who, you have a lot of, your middle-aged to older folks, that's what they check when they're looking at the news. They want to see obituaries. And in fact, the Post-Register, I think that kind of helps them out too, because obituaries are one of the number one things that they sell their papers for. But that's an important thing, you never want to miss the wedding of a close friend. You don't want to miss their funeral. There's some very important events in someone's life that you don't want to miss. Whereas, the story of somebody catching their 6-inch trout down at, there's important things about that obituary and that individual that really kind of drive that. Also, I think people have morbid curiosity. So people want to just kind of see what's going on in the community. How did they pass away? And
it's true.
So a little bit of that.
I know that there are some people, like you said, the newspaper, they get the paper simply for the obits. They go straight to the obituary section. So how many funerals do you think you've been to?
Oh man, well, this year we're on track to do about 700 funeral services.
Wow.
And
it's like 2 a day.
Yeah, and so and I've been here about 15 years. It's gone up every year. So do the math. I mean, last year we were about 675. So each year we've done a few more, but several thousand.
And you as being the funeral director, or at least on your funerals, you sit through the funeral, right? You're there.
Yeah.
So what makes a good funeral?
I think my favorite part of a funeral is when it's very personal. You make it about that person. And I think having times where people cry and people laugh, I think are important. Where you can experience every emotion and you can literally picture that person, saying that joke or saying that one-liner as his son left the house. And where you can really picture that individual at a funeral, those are my favorite.
And what would you say to people that might be planning a funeral? I'm sorry if you are, or thinking about their own funeral. What shouldn't you do? A 3-hour funeral, obviously.
Yeah.
You don't want a 3-hour funeral.
Right. I've seen so many funerals that I didn't think were going to work, and they worked. There's really nothing that I would say don't do, other than please get along. Sometimes you have families come together that haven't been around each other for a while.
Sure.
But I would say, as long as you're focused on that individual, less on yourselves and what's going on around you, but more on that individual, then it's gonna turn out right.
You're at a funeral. I'm sure you take in so much and learn so much about life. And you mentioned earlier about appreciating life, and especially at this sensitive time. What have you learned? I mean, what would you say to our audience that doesn't deal with this every day about appreciating life?
I think life is a lot shorter than we realize. And I get reminders on a daily basis of how quickly things can be taken away. And I think just being kind to one another, showing love, serving others when you get the opportunity, those are things that you remember and that you're grateful for. Another thing is, I think if you have a problem with your family or if there's a problem in your home, fix that, because I think you'll regret losing that. All too often at a funeral, someone will share a memory of saying, my dad and I haven't spoken in years, and they have horrible regrets from that. And I think if you can pick up the pieces from issues that you've had, serve each other, love each other, you'll be happy when it's all said and done.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much. Brian Wood, he is the owner of Wood Funeral Home and a funeral director. You can go to their website for more information about their services if you want to find out more. You'll probably have to one day, sadly. Thank you for talking with us, and thank you for watching. Have a good week.